Ευχαριστούμε πολύ τα στελέχη του New SciTech. Έχουμε άλλες 2 ομιλίες για να κλείσουμε τη θεματική ενότητα. Θα περάσουμε στον κύριο Πασχάλη Πισσαρίδη. Είναι board member του ISACA Cyprus Chapter και θα μας μιλήσει για την υιοθέτηση μιας προσέγγισης risk-based για την κυβερνοασφάλεια.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to also welcome you, and judging from the numbers that we've seen here, it's another successful InfoCom. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting ISACA Cyprus chapter to be a participant in this event. What I want to cover today, it's a big topic for us to adopting a risk-based approach to cybersecurity. Hopefully in the next 10-15 minutes I will be able to give you an overview of what risk management, from a risk management perspective, how we can tackle the cyber threat. What is cybersecurity? Cybersecurity is the protection of information assets at an organization from threats that can actually expose whether information that is processed or information that is stored or transported in an internet-connected information environment. So there are some key stakeholders when it comes to cybersecurity. So obviously the board of directors and the executive management, and those are the type of level, they set the tone at the top. So obviously these are the executives that need to become aware of the threats, the cyber threat that an organization faces, and this has to come from the security management, so the team that is responsible for implementing policies, for identifying threats and risks. So they have to keep the board informed, the executive informed, so that they can actually provide the resources, set the priorities, provide the tools in order for the security professionals to do their job when it comes to the cybersecurity. And again, when it comes to the professionals, the cyber security professionals, they need to have what I call a situational awareness. Every organization has its own culture, has its own unique environment that they operate in, the business objectives, and the business processes. So a security professional needs to have a very great understanding of the business environment that the organization is functioning in, as well as to be aware of the technology that is available, the tools that are available, the security measures that have been implemented at the organization, the lack thereof as well. So we need to be aware of the business plans and the strategy of the organization and align with the strategy of the organization and the risks that the organization is faced with. There are several approaches to implementing cybersecurity. It could be an ad hoc approach where we don't plan ahead and we just react to a particular risk, to a particular threat, or we implement something just because a vendor approached us with a nice tool that we were convinced to be a nice solution to have in our environment. We can be compliance-based. A new regulation comes about, GDPR, for example, that requires a bunch of things to be implemented. So we kind of go through the motion of implementing things in a checklist approach, whether those measures are needed or not. It's regulated, we implement it, and it's there. That's also not a very good approach. So we come down to the risk-based approach. The risk-based approach basically tells you that you need to recognize the environment you operate in, what are the assets, what are the threats to these assets, what are the vulnerabilities, and take an approach, a methodology to manage that particular risk or from the cyber threat. So we've seen what happened in Athens, in Greece, last year, back in July, with the fires in Rafina and Mati, and we've seen that the great loss of life that happened as a result, I would say, from very, very poor planning, very poor response, and we've seen that this type of destruction happened because of that, not taking a risk approach to managing this type of threat to a landlocked community of people living in the suburbs of Athens. Again, the risk approach here, the risk-oriented approach, basically tells us that we need to understand what are the most critical functions of cybersecurity, and that is to identify the assets that are under threat, to mitigate those threats by implementing cyber measures, countermeasures, security controls, and so on. And to have effective policy, to have security controls that are in place that are going to be effective in addressing the types of threats that the organization faces. And at the end of the day, with a cyber risk-based approach to address the cyber threat, you allow us to have decision-making that is going to be effective and efficient in managing the security threat that the organization is facing. And again, with limited budgets, this is something that one has to take that type of approach to managing the cyber threat. What are some of the influencing risk factors? And this is at the very high level. Obviously, we have the threat agents, and we have the various methodologies that are used by the hackers, the different types of threats that the organization is faced with. That obviously, for those threats to materialize, an organization has to have vulnerabilities in place. So those vulnerabilities, we need to understand what these vulnerabilities are in our environment, how can they be exploited, and how can we have, after the exploitation of a vulnerability, what type of an impact that will have in our environment, what kind of risk will this result to. This is at the high level. And again, this is the framing of the risk management. This is coming out of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's a publication that came out in 2012. I encourage most of you that are in this arena and you are security professionals. It's a 95-page document, very thorough. This is just a chart. We can't really go through and explain the whole model, but in a high level, again, we need to understand what are the threat and the sources for that threat to our organization. We need to understand what type of events can actually take place based on the types of vulnerabilities that we have. And everybody in every organization, yes, we do have vulnerabilities. Some of them are mitigated, some of them just because the way we work, the environment, maybe we don't have the means or the capability or the ability even to close every single vulnerability or address every single vulnerability. So what happens if a vulnerability gets exploited? We need to understand the impact, the severity of the impact, and the risk and the threat to our environment. And it could be a threat to the infrastructure, to the processes, to the systems, to applications, to people, etc. So all these factors contribute to the organizational risk. So we need to understand from a framework perspective, the controls are very important, the countermeasures are very important, the effectiveness with which these controls operate in our environment is critical. So we need to be able to have a good understanding of the effectiveness of the controls that are in place and their ability to counter such a threat from the cyber environment. So from a risk assessment perspective, risk is the possibility of a loss, of an impact to the organization against the digital asset that is exposed to the internet, in other words, and is exposed to the threat that's going to undertake a vulnerability, exploit that vulnerability, and then cause an impact, a severe impact to the organization. So from a risk assessment, from a risk management perspective, there are three different inputs that are key pylons to the management of this particular risk. We need to understand and assess our assets that are exposed to this type of cyber threat. We need to understand the threats that our organization is faced with. And we need to have a good understanding of the vulnerabilities that are endemic in our environment. So obviously, when we have the assets, we have to understand the criticality and the value of the asset so that we can take appropriate measures. We need to understand the threats, the adversary characteristics, the likelihood of an event taking place, the impact that particular threat will have in our environment. So there are three different methods of assessing a risk. It can be an asset-oriented, where first you define the assets in the organization that can be exposed to the cyber threat, and then you identify the potential threats to these assets and the vulnerabilities that these assets are faced with. The second approach would be a threat-oriented, where you identify first the threats that the environment is faced with, and then you proceed to see, okay, is this threat, if it's going to happen, what are the types of assets that are going to be exposed? What are the types of vulnerabilities that are going to be exploited that will actually give access to those assets? And a third method is the vulnerability-based, where first we identify deficiencies in our security infrastructure, the vulnerabilities in our environment, and then we take measures to address the vulnerabilities based on what types of assets are going to be exposed if such vulnerability gets exploited. Either way, any of these methods is appropriate. A combination of these methods, it depends on the situation as well. So I don't favor one over the other. But it's a combination of these types of assessment methodologies. Finally, managing risk, it's about managing different types of scenarios. So we have to be prepared with the types of threats that our environment is going to be faced with. And for us to be prepared, we need to develop scenarios. What if? What if a particular threat materializes? What's going to be the impact? What's the likelihood? So we have to take into consideration the threats, the different types of threats our environment is faced with. What are going to be the threat actors? Would it be external? Would it be our vendors? Would it be our contractors? Would it be employees? Would it be partners that we work with that have access to our systems? So we have to identify the potential threat actors to our environment. What are the types of events that are going to take place in case there is a cyber attack in our environment? What are going to be the assets that are going to be exposed? And the time is of essence. We need to be able to detect a particular attack as close as possible to the time that the attack takes place. Any lag in our response, in our detection, that's going to give the attacker the time to take control of our environment and make it much more difficult for us to build our resilience and minimize the type of risk. So again, understanding the event, having the means to detect it is of essence. From a risk management workflow, ISACA provides through COVID-5 for risk, another methodology based on the risk scenario that I explained earlier, where you do the risk analysis and we develop a mapping of all the risks that the organization is faced with. And then if the risk exceeds the risk appetite of the organization, or management, then we have to take action. We have to take response. What are the types of responses we can take? Is to avoid the risk possibly by not doing or not implementing that particular business process that's going to lead to the risk, or by mitigating the risk through countermeasures and controls, or sharing and transferring the risk by outsourcing it, which we don't really eliminate the risk. The risk is there, it's just that it's shared with another organization, another partner, or accepting the risk. If it's within the risk appetite of the company, of the organization, we can proceed and have management, advise management if they need, they can possibly accept the risk. Obviously, the effectiveness and efficiency of the response needs to be taken into consideration. The type of measures that we have in place, the type of measures that need to be implemented, that we don't have in place yet, that are going to address and make the environment more resilient against the threat. And then, after we do this exercise, then we have to prioritize. Again, we're working with very limited resources, limited tools, limited the human factor is very, very important. So we have to normalize, we have to find the type of priority for the types of risks that we're faced and prioritize those and implement the types of measures that are going to have the biggest impact in the organization. Finally, from a cyber security framework, we have again the National Institute of Standards and Technology as well as ENISA. We have another publication here on cybersecurity frameworks, another 50-page document, and for those of you that are interested in a deep dive into this type of framework. But what it basically tells you is that there are 5 factors that allow us to manage the cyber threat. First is to identify the types of threats to our environment, the types of assets that are exposed, data, the capabilities that we have as an organization to respond and react to that kind of threat, the type of protection that we need to implement, the countermeasures, the controls, that need to be implemented in the infrastructure of the organization. As I said, the type of detection mechanisms that we need to have in place to be able to become aware of a threat as close to the point of initiation as possible. And finally, if a threat materializes, despite the countermeasures, despite the controls that we had in place, then we need to have a methodology, a plan for responding. So we need to have an incident response plan where all the stakeholders are going to be involved, whether those are engineers, security professionals, forensic experts, outside help. Everybody has to be aligned, as well as the ability to recover. And the ability to recover is of essence. We need to have built-in resilience in our environment to be able to respond and recover our operations that have been affected. The time is up, so I can't really go on, but we can spend probably 2 days talking about the cybersecurity framework and models for managing risks. I wanted to thank again everybody and the organizers for allowing ISACA to be part of this great event. Thank you.